Was it some kind of test? Were they probing his loyalty? What kind of reply was expected? "We're a democratic nation, and you know it," he said. It came out more feebly than he had thought. "Oh, well, sure. This is just a state of emergency which has lasted unusually long. 72 years to be exact. If we hadn't lost World War III and needed a powerful remilitarization to overthrow the Soviet world. But we did." Berg took out a pack of cigarettes. "Smoke?" "I was just trying to explain to you why the subversives are so dangerous. They have to be, or they wouldn't stand any kind of a chance. When you set out to upset something as big as the United States government, it's an all or nothing proposition. They've had a long time now to organize, and there's a huge percentage of malcontents to help them out." "Malcontents?" "Well, look, Berg, I mean, you're the expert, and of course you know your business. But a natural human grumble at conditions doesn't mean revolutionary sentiments. These aren't such bad times. People have work, and their needs are supplied. They aren't hankering to have the hemispheric wars back again." "The standard revolutionary argument," said Berg patiently, "is that the rebels aren't trying to overthrow the nation at all, but simply to restore constitutional and libertarian government. It's common knowledge that they have help and some subsidies from the outside. But it's contended that these are merely countries tired of a world dominated by an American dictatorship, and being small Latin American and European states couldn't possibly think of conquering us. Surely you've seen subversive literature." "Well, yes. Can't help finding their pamphlets all over the place. And—" Lancaster closed his mouth. No. Damned if he was going to admit that he knew 3 coworkers who listened to rebel propaganda broadcasts. Those were silly, harmless kids. Why get them in trouble? Maybe get them sent to camp. "You probably don't appreciate the hold that kind of argument has on all too many intellectuals, and a lot of the common herd, too," said Berg. "Naturally you wouldn't. If your attitude had always been unsympathetic, these people aren't going to confide their thoughts to you. And then there are bought men and spies smuggled in, and I needn't elaborate. It's enough to say that we've been thoroughly infiltrated, and that most of their agents have absolutely impeccable dossiers. We can't give neoscope to everybody. You know, security has to rely on spot checks and the testing of key personnel. Only when organizations get as big as they are today, there's apt to be no real key man, and a few spies strategically placed in the lower echelons can pick up a hell of a lot of information. Then there are the colonists out on the planets. Our hold on them has always been necessarily loose, because of transportation and communication difficulties, if nothing else. And as I say, foreign powers, a little country like Switzerland or Denmark or Venezuela, can't do much by itself. But an undercover international pooling of resources. Anyway, we have reason to believe in the existence of a large, well-financed, well-organized underground, with trained fighting men, big secret weapons dumps, and saboteurs ready for the word go. To say nothing of a restless population and any number of covert sympathizers who'd follow if the initial uprising had good results. Or bad, depending on whose point of view you take," grinned the one-armed man. Lancaster put his elbows on his knees and rested his forehead on shaking hands. "What has all this got to do with me?" he protested. "I'm not the hero of some cloak and dagger spy story. I'm no good at undercover stuff. What do you want of me?" "It's very simple," Berg replied quietly. "The balance of power is still with the government, because it does have more of the really heavy weapons than any other group can possibly muster. Alphabet bombs, artillery, rockets, armor, spaceships, and space missiles. You see? Only research has lately suggested that a new era in warfare is developing. A new weapon as decisive as the Macedonian phalanx, gunpowder, and aircraft were in their day." As Lancaster raised his eyes, he met an almost febrile glitter in Berg's gaze. "And this weapon may reverse the trend. It may be the cheap and simple arm that anyone can make and use, the equalizer. So we've got to develop it before the rebels do. They have laboratories of their own, and their skill at stealing our secrets makes it impossible for us to trust the research to a project in the usual manner. The fewer who knew of this weapon, the better, because in the wrong hands it could mean Armageddon. The run from Earth was short, for the space laboratory wasn't far away at the moment as interplanetary distances go. Lancaster wasn't told anything about its orbit, but guessed that it had a path 1,000,000 miles or so sunward from Earth, and highly tilted with respect to the ecliptic. That made for almost perfect concealment, for what spaceship would normally go much north or south of the region containing the planets? He was too preoccupied during the journey to estimate orbital figures anyway. He had seen enough pictures of open space, and some of them had been excellent, but the reality towered unbelievably over all representations. There simply is no way of describing that naked grandeur, and when you have once experienced it, you don't want to try. His companions, Berg and the other one-armed Jessup, who piloted the spaceboat, respected his need for silence. The station had been painted non-reflecting black, which complicated temperature control but made accidental observation of its existence almost impossible. It loomed against the cold glory of stars like a pit of ultimate darkness, and Jessup had to guide the boat in with radar. When the last lock had clanged shut behind him, and he stood in a narrow metal corridor shut away from the sky, Lancaster felt a sense of unendurable loss. It faded, and he grew aware of others watching him. There were half a dozen people, a motley group dressed in any shabby garment they happened to fancy, with no sign of the semi-military discipline of a project crew. A Martian hovered in the background, and Lancaster didn't notice him at first. Berg introduced the humans casually. There was a stocky, gray-haired man named Fredericks, a lanky, space-tanned young chap called Isaacson, a middle-aged woman and her husband by the name of Dufrere, a quiet Oriental who answered to Huang, and a red-haired woman presented as Karen Marek. These, Berg explained, were the technicians who would be helping Lancaster. This end of the space station was devoted to the labs and factories. For security reasons, Lancaster couldn't be permitted to go elsewhere, but it was hoped he would be comfortable here. Pardon me, aren't you a rather mixed group?" asked the physicist. "Yes, very," said Berg cheerfully. "The Dufreres are French, Huang is Chinese, and Karen here is Norwegian, though her husband was Czech. Not to mention there you are. I didn't see you before. Dr. Lancaster, I'd like you to meet Rakan of Thyle, Mars, a very accomplished lab man." Lancaster gulped, shifting his feet and looking awkwardly at the small, gray feathered body and the beaked owl face. Rakan bowed politely, sparing Lancaster the decision of whether or not to shake the claw-like hand. He assumed Rakan was somebody's slave, but since when did slaves act as social equals? "But you said this project was top secret," he blurted. "Oh, it is," smiled Karen Marek. She had a husky, pleasant voice, and while she was a little too thin to be really good looking, she was cast in a fine mold, and her eyes were large and gray and lovely. "I assure you, non-Americans are perfectly capable of preserving a secret. More so than most Americans, really. We don't have ties on Earth, no one to blab to." "It's not well known today, but the original Manhattan Project that constructed the first atomic bombs had quite an international character," said Berg. "It even included German, Italian, and Hungarian elements, though the United States was at war with those countries." "Come along and we'll get you settled in your quarters," invited Isaacson. Lancaster followed him down the long hallways, rather dazed with the whole business. He noticed that the space station had a crude, unfinished look, as if it had been hastily thrown together from whatever materials were available. That didn't ring true for a government enterprise, no matter how secret. Berg seemed to read his thoughts again. "We've worked under severe handicaps," he said. "Look, just suppose a lot of valuable material and equipment were ferried into space. If it's an ordinary government deal, you know how many light years of red tape are involved. Requisitions have to be filled out in triplicate, every last rivet has to be accounted for. There'd simply have been too much chance of a rebel spy getting a lead on us. It was safer all around to use whatever chance materials could be obtained from salvage or through individual purchases on other planets. Ever hear of the Waikiki?" Seems so. Wasn't she